I grew up in the same city where I went to college. My friends all lived nearby, and my father owned a local hardware and building supply store. He wanted me to get my degree, return home, and help him out. Maybe even take over the store when I was ready. He made me work in the store, so I spent many evenings and weekends there, both before high school and during college. I loved talking to the contractors who came to buy materials from us, and when I made deliveries, I'd watch them work and ask questions. I wouldn't say I hated working in the store, but it wasn't my favorite thing. The best part of the job was the deliveries, especially when I did them alone. I never really wanted to take over the store. When I wasn't working there, like many other boys in town, I mowed lawns for pocket money. One day, I was working for a widow who was trying to fix an outbuilding in her yard. She struggled because she didn't have the right tools, wasn't strong enough for the hard work, and didn't know how to do the job. After I finished mowing, I offered to help her. I don't know where I found the courage to insist that she hire me, but I did. I pointed out her mistakes and told her that she wasn't strong or tall enough for the work. I offered to do the job for $50, as long as she bought the materials, and told her she didn't have to pay if she wasn't happy with the result. She agreed, and I completed the job to her satisfaction. She paid me, but more importantly, she told her friends about my work. Soon, I was getting calls from other women who needed help with repairs. I always made sure to do the job right, and if I wasn't sure about something, I'd ask one of my contractor friends. I charged less than a licensed contractor, but I was always honest with my prices. After working for several older women, I started getting calls from men as well. By the time I went to college, I had already started a small repair business and had acquired many of the licenses I needed. I also still ran my lawn care business, which sometimes meant hiring friends to help, especially during the busy summer months. I made enough money to pay for college, buy a new truck, and cover my dating expenses. I enjoyed my youth, though I worked long hours, and my dates often started later than most others. After finishing school, I grew tired of living with my parents, so I rented an apartment. I didn't like it much, so I started looking for a house to rent when my lease was up. One of my high school friends, Glenda, had just gotten divorced from my best friend, Joe. She caught him cheating with one of our classmates and filed for divorce. Glenda worked as a real estate agent and was struggling to make ends meet. We were talking one evening about her failed marriage at our favorite place, both of us living in apartments we didn't like. I mentioned that I was thinking about renting a house and asked if she had any affordable options. When I told her how much I could pay, she was surprised and said, "Stan, with a 30-year mortgage, you could get a decent house with that loan. Why don't you buy instead of renting? That way, you'll be building equity instead of just throwing money away on rent." I hadn't thought about it, but I told her I didn't have much for a down payment. She said, "Let me check a few things, and I'll get back to you." By the end of the evening, I'd forgotten about our conversation, but clearly she hadn't. The next Monday evening, Glenda called me and asked if I wanted to meet again. She was excited and said, "Stan, I found a few places you can afford, though most of them aren't in great areas. But there's one you might like. Remember Harris's old house on the edge of town?" I nodded, and she continued, "Well, when they got older, they built a new 3-car garage and turned it into an apartment for their mother, in case she needed care. The new garage was just a few feet from the house. Do you remember the house burned down 2 years ago?" I nodded again. They decided not to rebuild and moved to a retirement home. The garage was barely damaged. I talked to AA, and they want to sell it. The property is 20 acres, and they're asking $110,000. There's some work to do on the garage and apartment, but it could be a great fit for you. The best part is, all the utilities are already there, and new houses are being built nearby. A contractor will probably buy it soon and subdivide it. It's not on the MLS yet, so it's only been shown a couple of times. They're asking for $2,000 down and $20,000 for the first payment. The monthly payments would be about half of what you're paying in rent. I wasn't sure if I could afford it, but I really wanted to see it. I told her I would go check it out the next evening, Later that evening, I went to my father and asked if he could lend me money for the down payment. He wasn't too keen on the idea, but I reminded him that the monthly payments would be half of what I was paying for rent. I promised I'd pay him back each month after I renovated and furnished the apartment. Finally, he agreed to lend me the money if I decided to buy the place. The next evening, I visited the property again and fell in love with it all over again. Even with the charred remains of the house, the place was more beautiful than I remembered. The fire hadn't destroyed all the trees and bushes in the yard, and I could see a small stream flowing below. I told Glenda to prepare an offer for $90,000. On Tuesday evening after class, I got a call from Glenda. She sounded excited. "Stan, I can't believe it. When I presented the offer to Ida and Homer, they were about to reject it outright. But then AA asked Homer if he thought you were the one. They've known you for years, and when I said you did their lawn maintenance, they smiled and told me you were a good guy. Anyway, they're not accepting $90,000, but they countered with $97,500, which I think is a good deal. I didn't hesitate. Tell them I'll pay that amount and want ownership at closing. The bank required my father to be the guarantor for the loan, but everything went well, and I took possession of the property at the end of April. After making the necessary renovations, I moved into the apartment in early June. The following months kept me busy with my lawn care business and small construction projects. By then, I had 10 employees, most of them seasonal. I spent my free time cleaning up the property. After clearing the debris from the burn house, I asked an engineer friend to check the foundation. He said it was fine, and since the second floor hadn't burned, I could use it for the renovation, saving thousands of dollars in excavation and foundation work. The house was a small structure, about 1,000 square feet on the ground floor. I rented an excavator and extended the foundation towards a garage, doing most of the work myself. I used my free time and extra money to build a nice house for myself, connecting the house to the garage with a glass-covered gallery and a cement floor. I installed a large hot tub and put in a wood stove for heat. I even ran ductwork to the rest of the house. By the summer after I graduated from college, my new house was finished. It was 2,450 square feet, built with comfort and convenience in mind. I had stainless steel appliances, granite countertops, oak trim, and a brick exterior. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a prestigious house. I had a beautiful south-facing covered patio overlooking a small creek. I finished it for half the price it would have sold for. Patty adored me when we got married, but I was under the impression that she was marrying my house, not me. By the time I graduated from college, I was already moving on to new construction. I had built extensions, renovated old houses and garages, but most of my income came from new builds. I employed 20 people at the time. Patty started working for my father after we got engaged. After completing her degree, she became a full-time employee and assistant manager. Her father was grooming her to take over the business when he retired. I was an only child, so the business was meant to pass on to us. When my father passed away, I took on the role of buying material for the business, which increased the family income. Patty and I had been friends since childhood, and I thought, like most married men, that we would be together forever. We had the usual quarrels, but nothing serious. We dated throughout high school and later in college. We broke up a few times like most young couples do, seeing other people, but we always came back to each other. I had one girl who could have been the one, but one of my friends got involved with her first. During my final year of college, Patty and I became an exclusive couple. I proposed at Christmas, and she accepted. Patty arranged our wedding for September, after we graduated. The wedding almost didn't happen because Patty insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Looking back, I now think it was a mistake to marry. Let me continue the sad story. Patty had inherited several $100,000 from her grandfather, and either she or her father didn't want me to have access to it. I told her I wasn't going to spend her money, and was offended that she thought I'd marry her for it. That evening, we didn't speak kindly to each other. When my parents decided to visit, Patty became so angry she stormed out. As I let my parents in, I heard her say, "You need to talk to your son or this wedding might not happen." She rushed out, got in her car, and drove away. When my parents asked about our argument, I told them what had happened. My mom responded, "Stan, we know you don't marry for money, so what's the issue? Sign the contract and marry the girl if you love her." My dad, sitting with a frown on his face, asked to see the contract. He read it carefully and pointed out that it didn't account for any property I owned before the marriage or any potential inheritance. He suggested we consult a lawyer. I took his advice and we met with my lawyer, who made necessary changes to the contract. The revised version included protection for both Patty and me in case of divorce. I went to Patty's house that evening to show her the updated contract. When she and her father read it, they were both furious. Her father demanded, "Why the hell did you change this? You're saying she can take your house and business if you divorce." I calmly replied, "I think it's only fair that if her property and inheritance are protected, the same should apply to me." I added, "If the marriage ends due to infidelity, the innocent party gets 75% of the assets accumulated after the marriage." Patty and her father didn't like it, but after some tense days, Patty agreed to sign the modified contract. Afterward, we tried to move past the tension. We eventually forgave each other and got married as planned. For the next 2.5 years, we didn't regret our decision. However, things began to shift. I noticed a problem with Patty's job at the hardware store, the flirting. I tried to tell her she should be kind, not flirtatious, but she didn't see it that way. She argued that it was just her way of keeping clients happy, but I was still uncomfortable. The situation grew more strained when we both became busier. Patty worked late at the office handling bookkeeping, and I spent long hours on construction projects. Despite our success, our marriage started to suffer from neglect. I often passed by the office and saw other men, some of my friends there, and sometimes Patty would look flushed when I entered. It didn't feel right. Eventually, I disabled the alarm system at my father's store, which alerted us when anyone entered. I started showing up unannounced to see what was really going on. One evening, when I walked in, I found a few familiar faces, including Joe, one of my friends who had already gone through a divorce because he couldn't keep his hands off women. There they were, drinking beer and talking to Patty. Things finally came to a head when I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The man I had once been, who loved his wife deeply, was now embittered. My trust in Patty and my friends had shattered. I became determined to destroy everything: my wife, my business, and my so-called friends. What I once thought was the future, the life I had been building, now felt like ruins. The truth was hard to accept, but it was too late to stop the damage. I'm not planning to do anything that would land me in jail, but I feel like I could break down and go crazy. You're probably wondering why I've changed so much overnight. Well, I didn't change overnight. It's been building up for months. But when the moment came, everything shifted instantly. Listen to my story and follow me down the path of revenge. Last night, as I was driving past the store, I saw Joe and George's trucks parked outside. Something didn't feel right, so I pulled into the parking lot and walked up to the door, careful not to make any noise. I already had a feeling about what I'd find, and by the time I reached Patty's office, I could hear her moans and screams echoing from the middle of the building. I took out my phone and started recording. The office door wasn't even closed. I stood there watching and capturing photos as Joe and George had sex with my wife. George helped Patty up and kissed her, saying, "Come on, honey, take off your clothes. I want to play with your breasts." I stayed hidden, documenting everything as George helped her undress. I backed away from the door to avoid being seen and remembered that my father used to keep a tape recorder in his office. Hoping to capture their conversation, I searched for it, found it, and set it near the office door. Then I continued watching. My anger grew as I witnessed my wife with these two former friends. Joe said, "Patty, Are you glad you let me sleep with you at the Christmas party years ago? I told you this would be the best sex of your life. I was talking to Jared the other day and told him about this hot babe I'm sleeping with. He wants to meet you. Are you sure you won't let him come over one night?" Patty pushed him back slightly and said, "I like having sex with you too, I love it. But I don't want anyone else. I said I'd stick with you forever, but you have to be careful. Stan is already starting to get suspicious about how you two act around him. If you don't tone it down, I'll have to stop this." I had recorded and photographed enough. While in my father's office earlier, I'd noticed a baseball bat, and now I decided to use it to teach Joe and George a lesson. But as I picked it up, another thought struck me. George has always been jealous of me. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Susan, who I dated a few times before they got serious. I enjoyed my time with her, and I wondered if seducing her again might be a better way to get back at George than just beating him up. That kind of revenge would cut deeper. I left the building, setting the alarm and reconnecting the doorbell wires before heading out. I wanted Patty and her two friends to trip the alarm as they left, forcing them to deal with the police. Patty came home very late that night. She approached me nervously, her face betraying her anxiety. "What's wrong?" I asked, acting casual. She stammered. "I was late at work trying to balance the books. It took longer than I thought." Feigning curiosity, I said, "Really? What were you doing tonight?" "I thought about stopping by since you were so late." Her face turned pale, then flushed. "You're used to my late nights," she said quickly. "I didn't think you want to come by." Joe and George came in close to closing time, paid for their orders, and left shortly after. I was just doing the bookkeeping. I nodded with a grin. "Great. Let's take a hot bath together. I've been excited all day." "No, sorry, honey," she replied nervously. "I'm really tired. Let's do this in the morning." I chuckled inwardly, noting her discomfort. That night, I resolved to get checked for any infections, wondering how many times I'd unknowingly received secondary pleasure. The next morning, I left early and called my lawyer as soon as his office opened. We met at noon, and over lunch, I explained the situation. I wanted an immediate divorce, citing Patty's infidelity, and insisted that the prenuptial agreement be enforced. I showed him the photos and played the recording, but asked that the audio only be used if absolutely necessary. "Why leave George out of the lawsuit?" my lawyer asked. "I have plans for him," I replied with a smirk. After the divorce, I plan to seduce his wife, Susan. That'll hurt him more than anything else. I also have my sights set on Joe's fiancée. My lawyer sighed. "Stan, this might backfire on you, but technically, there's nothing illegal about it. Just be prepared. Things could get messy." On Wednesday, my lawyer called to say the divorce papers were ready. That same afternoon, Patty received them and the scandal exploded. My father called furious, as did Patty's father. Both demanded explanations, but I stood firm. By evening, my parents came over to talk. My mom was devastated, having always loved Patty, but I convinced them it was best to fire her from the family business to protect our interests. The next morning, Patty found out she had not only lost her husband, but also her job. Furious, she filed a countersuit for divorce and a wrongful termination claim against my father. It was clear this battle would cost us all. Later that week, I ran into an old friend, Glenda, at a bar. She slid into the booth across from me and asked bluntly, "What's this I hear about you and Patty?" I smiled bitterly. "It's true. I caught her with Joe. Let's just say it's over." I showed Glenda the pictures I had taken and told her I had filed for divorce. She shook her head and sighed. "People in town are saying you were just jealous of Patty's male friends and filed out of spite. She's also claiming you acted vindicatively, forcing your father to fire her so she couldn't make a living." I laughed dryly. "Well, Dad did fire her, but it wasn't out of spite. She crossed the line when she used the office for what she did. After that, Dad asked our accountant to check the books. Whatever they found, it wasn't good. There were a lot of mistakes on her part. Let's just leave it at that." Glenda nodded, a trace of sympathy in her expression. I'm sorry, Stan. I know how you feel. Joe did the same thing to me. That man could never keep it in his pants. I noticed a tear escape down her cheek. Reaching over, I wiped it away gently. Yeah, Joe's always been like that. He's dated half the women in town, and a good number of married ones, too. But I never thought he'd do this to a friend. We shared a couple of beers, reminiscing and commiserating. When the evening wound down, I walked Glenda to her car. Before getting in, she kissed me softly on the cheek. It'll get better, Stan. You'll see. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. Some of my friends supported me, while others sided with Patty and stopped talking to me altogether. Work became awkward, as I had to deal with unfriendly colleagues who had taken her side. One Sunday afternoon, I was at home, trying to drown my frustration with whiskey. I was tipsy, stumbling over myself when I heard someone call my name from the yard. Attempting to get up from my chair, I tripped and fell, landing in a small puddle of spilled whiskey. Looking up, I saw Glenda standing there, laughing at the sight of me sprawled out. Need some help, Stan, she teased, crouching down and offering her hand. Despite the embarrassment, I couldn't help but notice her smooth, toned legs. She caught my gaze and smirked. Eyes up here, buddy, she said, shifting her knees away. I took her hand, and she helped me to my feet. After a bit of shared laughter, I invited her to sit with me. For the next hour, we talked about life, but my mood remained dark. Eventually, Glenda looked at me with concern. Stan, did I do something to upset you? You've been so distant. The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. Finally, I whispered, No, Glenda, you're one of the few people who still visits me. It's just, everything feels so broken. My marriage, my dreams, it's all gone. I thought I had the perfect life, and now I'm left with nothing but anger and plans for revenge. Her eyes softened. Stan, you can't live like this. It'll only hurt you in the end. What are you planning to do? Taking a deep breath, I confessed. I want to hurt Patty, Joe, George, and everyone who stood by them. I want to seduce their women the way they seduce mine. Glenda stood abruptly, her face a mix of shock and sadness. Stan, don't do this. You'll hurt innocent people. You'll regret it. Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. I don't know if I can stand by and watch you become someone so cruel. Please, promise me you'll think this through. She didn't wait for my response. Turning, she walked to her car and drove away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The divorce proceeded quickly thanks to the prenuptial agreement, but Patty's wrongful termination lawsuit was a tougher battle. In court, she painted my father and me as tyrants, twisting facts to suit her narrative. Our lawyer, however, skillfully dismantled her claims. Witnesses testified to her unprofessional behavior, including her habit of drinking beer during work hours and flirting with clients. The company accountant revealed she had given Joe and George excessive credit and ignored company policies to protect the business. By the end of the trial, the judge ruled against Patty. He even warned her that her actions bordered on criminal negligence. She and her father stormed out of the courtroom, their faces pale with humiliation. Later that evening, my lawyer, Lawrence, informed me that my divorce had been finalized. Relief washed over me as I realized that chapter of my life was officially closed. That night, my parents and I sat on their patio, sharing a barbecue and drinks. There was a bittersweet air to the evening, relief at the outcome but sadness for how things had ended. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile, knowing this was the start of a new chapter. I sat with my parents on the patio, the warm evening air doing little to soothe my anger. I still can't believe my friends would betray me like this, I said, my voice shaking. I feel so alone, and if I have to, I'll make them pay for what they've done. My mother's face turned pale. Stan, she said softly, please don't let bitterness consume you. A man who lives with revenge in his heart is a man who loses everything. Take the higher road. Live your life fully and with integrity. In the long run, it will make you happier. And maybe, just maybe, it will make those three regret what they did to you. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk interrupted us. A familiar voice called out, "Thank you, Mrs. Train." That's exactly what I've been trying to tell him. Glenda stepped onto the patio, her presence a welcome but unexpected surprise. She looked directly at me, her expression a mix of understanding and urgency. "Stan, I know the pain you're going through. Believe me, I've been there. When Joe betrayed me, I was consumed by the need for revenge. I wanted to make him suffer, to drag it out so he'd feel the same emptiness I did. But over time, I realized that holding on to that anger only hurt me. Letting it go made me stronger and freer. I became a better person without him dragging me down." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, Stan, don't let revenge define you. It won't fix the hurt. It will only deepen it. Learn from this. Be more cautious about the people you let into your life. Let this pain guide you toward being a better person, not someone who stoops to their level." Her words struck a chord. I looked at her, standing there bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The light outlined her figure, her thin dress offering an unintentionally revealing silhouette. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest and quickly averted my eyes, ashamed. I'm not even divorced yet, and here I am letting my mind wander about Glenda, I thought bitterly. She smiled faintly, breaking the tension. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I was on my way to the tavern and wanted to congratulate you on your victory in court today. Everyone's been talking about it." Her expression turned serious again. "But I also came to warn you. Patty's friends have been spreading rumors and making threats. Please, Stan, stay vigilant. And be careful if you're drinking too much." With that, she turned and left quickly, leaving us sitting in stunned silence. My mother was the first to speak. "I just can't believe it. Why would anyone go so far? How could they be so cruel?" We sat quietly for a while, avoiding heavy topics and letting the conversation drift to lighter subjects. Eventually, I decided I was sober enough to drive home. Just as I was getting ready to leave, the phone rang. My mom answered and immediately paled. "Oh no," she said, her voice shaking. "He'll come as soon as he can." Hanging up, she turned to my dad. "Cedric, it's the police. The store's alarm went off, and they need you to come turn it off. They said most of the windows have been broken. When we arrived at the store, 2 police cars were already there. After turning off the alarm, we walked through the building with the officers. Though nothing appeared to be stolen, many goods were damaged by thrown stones. We called my mom to bring sleeping bags so we could spend the night guarding the store. The next morning, we contacted the insurance company to arrange for the windows to be replaced. That evening, when I finally returned home, I found my own windows shattered. I called the police to report the vandalism. They asked if I had any suspects. "A few months ago, I would have said no," I replied. "But now, after everything that's happened, after what I heard last night, I have my suspicions." I explained my situation, the divorce, Patty's affair, and her father's anger at how it all unfolded. I mentioned the threats her friends had made. The officers took my statement and assured me they would investigate. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm after the vandalism, though it was far from normal. My parents tried to move on, but I struggled. During the day, work kept me occupied, but at night, the loneliness hit hard. I hadn't been truly alone in years, and the silence was unbearable. To escape the emptiness, I started going out to sports bars or cafes for dinner. Sometimes I ran into old friends who tried to cheer me up or convince me to drink less, but I rarely listened. Occasionally, I'd bump into Glenda, who always encouraged me to let go of my anger and start fresh. One Thursday evening, I was nursing a drink at a local bar when I noticed a group of women at a nearby table. They were laughing, their energy contagious. One of them caught my eye, Susan, George's wife. I couldn't shake the thought that no one else knew George had been one of Patty's lovers. My promise to make him pay lingered in my mind as I approached the table where Susan sat with her friends. "Hi, Susan," I said, my voice calm but deliberate. "Long time no see. Care to dance?" Susan looked up at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then, as if deciding it was harmless, she smiled. "Of course, Stan." I offered her my hand, helping her up and wrapping a light arm around her waist as we walked to the dance floor. The song ended almost as soon as we started, and Susan began to turn back toward her table. "Come on, Susan," I said, holding her gently by the wrist. "You promised me a dance. Can't you stay for one full song?" She hesitated but then smiled again, relaxing into my arms as the next song began. As we swayed to the slow rhythm, she sighed. "You've always been a great dancer, Stan. I wish George would take me out dancing more. I loved it so much when we were dating." She rested her cheek against my chest, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt simple again. But then she raised her head, her words cutting through the mood like a blade. "You know, Stan, you only have yourself to blame for being so lonely. If you weren't so jealous, you wouldn't have lost Patty." I froze, pulling back slightly to meet her eyes. "Jealous?" I hissed, my voice low but trembling with fury. "Jealous because I wouldn't stand for my wife sleeping with my friends? You're damn right I kicked her out, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But don't mistake that for not missing her." Susan's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you talking about? I heard you kicked Patty out just because she was flirting. That's what George told me." I felt my anger rise to a boiling point. "Flirting? Is that what he told you? Let me show you something, Susan." Before she could protest, I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. I shoved it toward her, swiping to the incriminating pictures. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the images. A gasp escaped her lips, followed by tears that spilled down her cheeks. She dropped the phone as if it burned her and bolted toward her friends, sobbing uncontrollably. I scrambled to pick up my phone and tried to follow her, but her friends blocked my way. "What did you do to her, Stan?" one of them demanded angrily. "We thought you were a decent guy." "I didn't mean to hurt her," I said, my voice cracking. I managed to push past them and knelt beside Susan, taking her hand gently. "Susan, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have shown you those pictures. When you didn't believe me, I lost control." One of her friends picked up my phone and began scrolling through the images. The group murmured in shock, their anger now split between me and George. Finally, Susan looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. "Just go away, Stan," she whispered. "Leave me alone." I stood defeated and retrieved my phone from her friend. I left the bar, the weight of what I had done pressing heavily on me. As I drove home, shame washed over me. I had wanted revenge on George, but all I had done was hurt Susan, a woman I genuinely liked. At home, I sat on the patio, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring into the moonlit trees. The cool night air did little to ease my guilt. I was deep in thought when I heard the crunch of tires on my driveway. I ignored the sound until I heard knocking at my front door. A voice called out, "Stan, where are you? I'm not leaving until you talk to me." The knocking moved to the back door, and I finally turned toward the sound. "All right, stop banging on my house," I called out. "I'm here. What do you want?" Glenda stepped into view, her face a mask of anger. "Damn it, Stan. I just came from the bar. Did you really have to hurt Susan like that? You couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Before I could respond, she swung at me. I caught her wrist midair, but the force of her motion threw her off balance, and she fell into my lap. "Glenda, stop," I said firmly, holding her in place. "If you don't, one of us is going to get hurt." She stilled, her breathing heavy. I loosened my grip, and she moved to a nearby chair, glaring at me. "Why did you have to show her those pictures, Stan?" Do you think that made anything better? I didn't mean for her to see them, I explained. She accused me of lying about Patty and Joe, and I lost my temper. I forgot George's photos were on there too. I didn't do it to hurt her, but she needed to know the truth about George. If anything, she should have figured it out by now. He's cheated on her enough times before. Glenda sighed deeply, her anger softening into weariness. Stan, everyone at the bar was saying you were a creep. They said you hurt Susan for no reason. I need to hear from you. What really happened? I tossed her my phone. Call her yourself and ask, I said bitterly. Before she could respond, the sound of screeching tires and a loud crash broke the stillness of the night. A car door slammed, followed by heavy footsteps. Stan, a man's voice roared. Get out here, you son of a... I turned to see George stomping through my house, swinging a tire iron and breaking things as he went. When he spotted Glenda and me on the patio, he didn't bother opening the sliding screen door. He walked straight through it, his eyes wild with rage. You had no right to show Susan those pictures, he shouted, swinging the tire iron at me. I dodged the blow, grabbing a chair to use as a shield. You ruined my marriage, Stan, George screamed, tears streaming down his face. And now, I'm going to destroy you. He lunged again, this time aiming the tire iron at my head. As George swung the tire iron at me, I struggled to lift a heavy chair to block his blow. My foot caught on the edge of the flower bed, and I lost my balance, falling backward. The chair tumbled onto me, and pain shot through my body as George tripped and collapsed on top of me. The tire iron slipped from his grip, but he kept trying to hit me. Suddenly, the officers arrived and pulled George off me, quickly handcuffing him. One officer dragged him to the patrol car, while another helped me to my feet. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked. I stood there, breathing heavily, shaking from the adrenaline. Glenda rushed over and hugged me tightly. "I think we're okay," I said hoarsely. "He got a few hits in, but I'll be fine. Give us a moment, please." As the officer stepped back, I held Glenda close. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. I ran my hand through her hair and down her back. "Hush, Glenda," I whispered. "It's over. It's okay now." She finally stopped sobbing, her breathing steadied, and she leaned into me. I kissed the top of her head and turned to the officer. "She's calmer now. We can continue." More people arrived, detectives with notepads and cameras. It took 2 hours to provide my statement and show them the damage to my home. George had crashed into Glenda's car in his drunken fury, adding drunk driving and property damage to his growing list of charges, which now included burglary, assault, and possibly attempted murder. When the officers finally left, Glenda was still clinging to me, quietly crying as we sat on the couch. By then, it was almost 3 a.m. I stayed with her until she fell asleep. Gently, I carried her to the guest room, removed her shoes, and tucked her in. Exhausted, I retreated to my own room. The next morning, a knock on the damaged front door startled me awake. Footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder as they neared my bedroom. I jumped out of bed and hid behind the door, bracing myself in case it was someone hostile. But when the voices grew clearer, I recognized them, my parents and Susan. Emerging from my hiding spot, I startled them. Susan and Mom gasped at my disheveled appearance, while Dad said, "Damn, Stan, you look terrible. Are you okay, son?" My arm was bruised and nearly immobile. Scratches lined my face, and I was covered in dirt from the night before. "I'll be fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "The arm hurts like hell, and the house is a wreck, but I'm alive." Susan approached me and hugged me tightly. Her voice cracked with guilt. "Oh, Stan, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. When George came home drunk last night, I didn't let him in. I threw some of his clothes on the porch and told him we were done. I mentioned the pictures on your phone. I didn't know he'd try to kill you." As she spoke, Glenda appeared. She hovered by the doorway, her face pale and fearful. She stepped closer, lightly touching my hand, but I winced and she pulled back, looking mortified. I grabbed her hand to reassure her, and she hesitated before leaning into me. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this, Glenda," I said softly, glancing at Susan. "She saw the whole thing last night. George even tried to attack her. Glenda's blouse, torn during the fight, caught my attention. A smear of blood on the fabric made my stomach churn. I turned her toward me, gently opening the blouse. "Glenda, are you hurt? Why didn't you tell me?" "It's just a scratch," she murmured, trying to cover herself. My mom and Susan led her to the bathroom to clean and bandage the wound. While they were gone, Dad and I made coffee. When the women returned, Glenda was wearing one of my shirts. She quietly took the chair next to mine, and we all sat together, discussing the events of the previous night. By lunchtime, the chaos had started to settle. After a hot shower, I made Glenda take one too. We ate together, and I realized how hungry I was. I hadn't eaten since the night before. Calls from friends and colleagues flooded in throughout the day, some just checking in, others offering support. Among them was a cryptic call from my ex-wife. She didn't introduce herself, but I recognized her voice. "You're a lucky bastard," she said before hanging up. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. I repaired the house, resumed work, and even saw an uptick in business after the news of my ordeal spread. But one change was permanent: Glenda. She insisted on checking on me regularly, making sure I was eating and taking care of myself. Eventually, I gave her a key to my house. Coming home to her warmth and care became the highlight of my day. One evening, as we sat on the terrace, enjoying dessert under the stars, I shared my fears about the future. Glenda looked me in the eyes and said, "Stan, I'm here because I want to be. I see more in you than you sometimes see in yourself. The past is the past. We can build something better together." Her words touched me deeply. The trials we'd faced had only strengthened our bond. The next day, I bought a ring. That night, with candles flickering and music playing softly, I knelt before her. "Glenda," I said, "you are my rock and my joy. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. "Yes, Stan, I will." Our wedding was small and intimate, surrounded by those who mattered most. Glenda became not just my wife, but my true partner and best friend. Every evening when I come home, I'm reminded that I'm not alone. Together, we've built a life filled with love, resilience, and hope for the future.